History remembers Patty Duke as a bright-eyed symbol of classic American television. To millions of viewers, she looked cheerful, energetic, and endlessly charming. But behind that famous smile was a frightened child who had been stripped of her identity and molded into a profitable product. The public knew her as Patty Duke, but she had been born Anna Marie Pierce in Queens, New York, into a deeply unstable household. Her father struggled with alcoholism and eventually abandoned the family. Her mother battled severe depression and was barely able to care for her children. The environment was chaotic and fragile, leaving young Anna Marie vulnerable to anyone who promised stability. That vulnerability attracted the attention of two people who would permanently change the course of her life: John and Ethel Ross. The Rosses were theatrical managers who specialized in handling child actors. To outsiders, they appeared helpful, almost parental. But their real ambition was to create a star they could control completely. When they met Anna Marie, they saw more than a shy little girl with a thick Queen's accent. They saw opportunity. They approached her mother not with cold business contracts but with warm promises. They insisted the child had extraordinary talent but needed the right environment to succeed. Queens, they said, was the wrong place. The girl needed professional guidance, discipline, and polish. Gradually, they convinced Anna Marie's overwhelmed mother that the best chance for her daughter's future was to let the Rosses take over. It was a decision that would haunt the family for decades. Once Anna Marie moved into the Ross apartment in Manhattan, the transformation began immediately. The Rosses believed child stars were not discovered, they were manufactured. The first step was destroying the girl's original identity. One day, John Ross looked at the young girl and announced bluntly, "Anna Marie is dead. You are Patty now." The name Patty Duke was carefully selected. It sounded cheerful, friendly, and all-American. The Rosses believed Anna Marie Pierce sounded too ethnic and too working class. Their new creation needed a marketable identity. But the changes went deeper than a name. The Rosses hated her Queen's accent. They forced her through endless speech exercises until her natural voice disappeared. They demanded she speak with a polished television accent that sounded calm and proper. Every trace of her background had to be erased. They also altered her history. They shaved years off her age and instructed her to lie during auditions. Even the smallest details of her life were rewritten to fit the image they wanted. For a young child, this created a devastating psychological split. Inside was Anna Marie, the frightened girl from Queens. But the outside world only knew Patty, the cheerful performer who smiled on command. Over time, the line between the two began to blur. The Rosses also ensured that Patty depended entirely on them. They restricted her contact with her parents and slowly dismantled the family connection. Her father was banned completely. The Rosses described him as dangerous and unreliable. Her mother was treated even more cruelly. She was occasionally allowed to visit the apartment, but not as a mother. Instead, she was permitted to come by and do laundry. Imagine the emotional damage of that situation. A child watching her own mother wash clothes in the home of the people who had taken her away. The Rosses constantly repeated a message designed to control her. Your parents failed you. They didn't want you. We are the only ones who love you. The manipulation worked. Patty grew up believing the Rosses were her only support system. Their control extended to every aspect of her daily life. Privacy barely existed. Even the bathroom door was not allowed to be closed. John Ross often walked in to check on her, claiming he needed to supervise her hygiene. Food became another method of domination. The Rosses strictly controlled her diet to keep her thin for the camera. But their punishments could be shocking. On one terrifying evening, Ethel Ross forced Patty to eat a large plate of food despite the child feeling sick with anxiety. When she inevitably vomited, Ethel forced her to eat the vomit as punishment. It was humiliation disguised as discipline. By the time Patty reached 12 years old, the Rosses had completely molded her into the obedient performer they wanted. The frightened child from Queens had been buried beneath a polished television personality. But controlling a child's mind was not enough for the Rosses. They also wanted to control her body. To maintain the demanding pace of the entertainment industry, they began giving her drugs. Each morning she was handed amphetamines, powerful stimulants often prescribed at the time for dieting or energy. The drugs allowed Patty to work extraordinary hours under studio lights while memorizing large amounts of dialogue. But amphetamines came with a problem. They made sleep nearly impossible. So at night, the Rosses administered heavy sedatives, barbiturates strong enough to knock out an adult. Sometimes they even gave the teenage girl alcohol to force her into sleep. This brutal cycle of stimulants and sedatives destroyed her natural rhythms. Her brain swung between artificial highs and crushing exhaustion. Unbeknownst to the Rosses, Patty had a genetic vulnerability to bipolar disorder. The constant chemical extremes only intensified the condition, laying the foundation for decades of mental health struggles. Meanwhile, her career was exploding. In 1962, Patty starred in the film adaptation of The Miracle Worker alongside Anne Bancroft. The role required raw emotional intensity as she portrayed Helen Keller's early struggles. Her performance stunned Hollywood. At just 16 years old, she won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress, becoming the youngest winner in the category at the time. To the public, it looked like a fairy tale success story. But behind the scenes, nothing changed. The Rosses tightened their control even further. They moved her to a new apartment purchased with her own earnings and maintained strict surveillance over her life. Soon television producers created a sitcom built entirely around her fame, The Patty Duke Show. The premise was simple and clever. Patty played two cousins with opposite personalities. One studious and reserved, the other loud and energetic. To viewers, it was a light-hearted comedy. But the irony was haunting. The two characters mirrored the psychological split inside Patty herself. Filming the show was exhausting. Because she played both roles, she appeared in nearly every scene. The Rosses increased her stimulant doses to keep her functioning through long filming days. As the years passed, the strain became visible. Her behavior grew erratic. She experienced mood swings, bursts of energy, and periods of deep despair. Crew members whispered that she was difficult or unstable. Few understood they were witnessing the effects of heavy medication and untreated mental illness. By 1965, Patty was 18 years old and finally reaching adulthood. The Rosses' ability to control her began to crumble. Her escape came through an unlikely ally, assistant director Harry Falk. He treated her kindly and listened when she spoke. For Patty, it was the first time an adult man showed concern without trying to control her. Marriage offered a legal path out of the Ross household. Despite their furious opposition, she married Falk and walked out of the apartment that had been her prison for a decade. But freedom brought a devastating surprise. Patty believed she was wealthy after years of successful films and television. Yet when lawyers investigated her finances, they discovered nearly everything was gone. The Rosses had taken massive management fees and charged their own lavish lifestyle to her accounts. Even worse, they had failed to pay her taxes. At 18 years old, Patty Duke discovered she was essentially broke and owed large sums to the government. The betrayal shattered her. Determined to destroy the wholesome image the Rosses created, she accepted a role in the controversial 1967 film Valley of the Dolls. The story followed women consumed by addiction and fame. For Patty, the role was personal. It mirrored the chaos of her own life. But leaving the Rosses did not heal the damage they had caused. Without strict control, her untreated bipolar disorder intensified. She experienced extreme spending sprees, impulsive relationships, and emotional breakdowns. By the early 1970s, her life had become a storm of mania and depression. She married and divorced, struggled with alcohol, and endured public scandals. The turning point finally arrived in 1982. A psychiatrist carefully reviewed her history. The sleepless nights, explosive energy, deep despair, and erratic decisions. He delivered a diagnosis that changed everything. Patty Duke had bipolar disorder. Instead of feeling devastated, she felt relief. For decades she believed she was simply flawed or morally weak. Now she understood she had a medical condition. With treatment, including lithium medication, her mind gradually stabilized. For the first time since childhood, she experienced calm. In the years that followed, she became an outspoken advocate for mental health awareness, speaking openly about bipolar disorder and the importance of treatment. The smiling child star the world once knew had endured manipulation, exploitation, and psychological damage. But she survived, and eventually used her voice to help others facing similar struggles. Behind the image of Patty Duke was always Annemarie Pierce, the girl from Queens who refused to disappear forever. If you love the scandals, rivalries, and secrets behind Hollywood's biggest legends, subscribe to Hollywood Feuds.